Like it or not, sometimes size matters. My guest today argues that it matters if you want to stay private. Is he right? He'll explain what he means, why he thinks it, and if you agree, how you can get started. I'm Carl White, principal at Market Advisory Group, which is a healthcare marketing agency, and I'm also the host of Practice Care. The mission for both is the same, and that's to help private practice owners stay private. Not only is that what they usually want, but care is better when the provider owns the practice because that's when they're going to have the most freedom to make the clinical decisions they think are best. It's just different when somebody else owns the practice. Sometimes, usually, eventually, the agenda starts to creep in and nothing bad really ever happens, but it's more for them to think about compromises they may have to make. Let's just keep it all privately owned and get rid of all that to begin with. And my guest today is Perrin DesPortes. Perrin is one of the co-founders of Polaris Healthcare Partners. He's a Washington and Lee University graduate and earned his MBA from the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Perrin has over 25 years of experience in the business side of dentistry, having run 3 different business units for Patterson Dental Supply over a 15-year career. Perrin's happily married and has an 8-year-old daughter at home. And in his spare time, he's an avid cyclist and tennis player. More power to you. No judgments, and enjoys cooking and reading. He loves good red wine. Agree on that. And strong coffee. Agree on that too. And I'm curious why the strong coffee. But Perrin, first, thanks for coming on Practice Care.
Carl, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Appreciate
Me
it very
too.
much.
This is an important topic because the days are gone when you can hang a shingle and everybody understands that. But what do you do after you realize that? And this is one avenue to think about. But before we get into that and group practices and scaling, I want to start with where I start with every guest. Help us understand you better. Fill in the gaps of your bio. I'm curious how you arrived at Polaris and, why you're doing what you're doing. And hit the coffee thing too, because nobody likes weak coffee, but
No, I am a coffee snob, so maybe I'll conclude with that.
Okay.
But yeah, how we found ourselves at where we are and being an entrepreneur and everything is a circuitous route. But I was born into a dental distribution business of all things. My family owned a business called Thompson Dental Company that was headquartered out of Columbia, South Carolina. The business was founded in 1899 by my great-grandfather, James Perrin Thompson. My grandfather was chairman of the board. My father was president and CEO when I entered the business in 1995.
Wow.
I'm biased, but it was a pretty well-run company and growing quite nicely through much of its history and certainly into the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the we talk about businesses and growing businesses and operating businesses and profitability and EBITDA and probably a lot of other stuff we'll get into today.
Right.
But one of the things we rarely talk about is how a family business is transitioned from one owner, one generation to the next. And sure enough, that was the challenge in our family business. I said my father was president and CEO. My grandfather was chairman of the board. My dad has 2 sisters, neither of whom were working in the business, nor were their husbands, nor were any of their children. But upon my grandfather's ultimate demise, the estate was set up to be share and share alike. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a math major to figure out voting control when you have 2/3 ownership of a business that doesn't work in the business, doesn't really have any operational concerns for the business, doesn't want to be part of the business, but would love to get their money out. And in a successful business, getting your money out means borrowing money from a bank, levering the business to take shareholders out of the ownership equation. And so this was something that had kind of been baked in the cake. And the more the business became successful, was the bigger the mountain became too. So, if we rewind the clock back to the late 90s, early 2000s, you might remember the dot-com burst. And at that point in 2000, 2001, there weren't a lot of venture capital firms, private equity groups or otherwise, that were really looking to buy a dental distribution business. It's not a very sexy business, even though it was about $100 million on the revenue run rate that year and probably 12 to 13 sales offices from Baltimore through Orlando, if I remember correctly. Had a technology component, dental software component, digital x-rays and integrated services and all that kind of good stuff. Really a business that could be built for scale, but ultimately was forced to be built for sale. And at that point, there are only 2 suitors for the business, 2 publicly traded companies, Shine and Patterson. And I like to say that Minnesota nice plays best with Southeastern values. And it was a really good acquisition by Patterson. It was a really good sale for the family members. I was fortunate enough to be able to stay on for 15 years with Patterson and run 3 different businesses, like you
Yeah.
referenced. And while I always wish I had more time to work with and for my dad, I learned things about business at an enterprise level that I never would have if I had had the responsibilities at Thompson Dental Company. So I'm forever grateful to the leaders of Patterson for giving me an opportunity early on. At
Hmm.
the age of 31, they tapped me to lead the Richmond branch, and I was the youngest person in that branch. It was a little bit of a turnaround effort, but I
Mm.
hired a few good people. We did a couple of things right, and in 4 years, that business was performing quite nicely. Was able to move to the Metro New York, New Jersey market for 4 years, and then decided that I didn't want to live in Minneapolis because I'm not built for that, being from
You
South
are.
Carolina originally. So,
The entire
um,
second story of the city is connected, at least downtown. I
yeah,
spent a summer there and I went, why did I know why they need that? But holy cow. At
yeah,
least you learn, right? Am I
I
built for
used to
that or
go up.
not?
Yeah, I used to go up there for budget planning sessions at the end of January, and
Oh,
holy moly, it's a different world. So,
yes.
at the end of the New York, New Jersey tour, I was able to kind of put my name in the hat for a smaller branch back in the southeast, nearer to home, and that became Charlotte for me. And
Hmm.
finished my career with Patterson at the end of 2016. And at that point, I had a couple of industry colleagues that all saw the same thing that I did, that there were a lot of entrepreneurs who happened to be dentists that wanted to build a multi-location group. And
Hmm.
there weren't many resources on how to do that. Traditional dental practice management consultants focus on things at an operational or clinical level, like case
Hmm.
acceptance and hygiene retention and scheduling efficiencies. And all that's very important, but
Hmm.
that's not really what
Yeah.
building a multi-location group is going to be all about. So I've formed a prior company to Polaris called Tusk Partners with a couple of industry colleagues, one of whom, DeWalker Sinha, is my partner at Polaris. We left Tusk at the beginning part of 2021 to launch Polaris, and Polaris is part consulting company to help people build and grow group practices, and Polaris is part sell side advisory or recap of a business to help them exit the business if they want to sell the business at the end of their journey. So we're kind of like a general dentistry practice. The consulting business is like the hygiene department, and the sell side advisory business is like the operative restorative side of the business.
Okay. Okay. And we're talking about group practices and,
Yeah.
who should do it and why. But let's just start with a simple definition of the term. When you say group practice, what do you mean? So that you and I and listeners are all thinking of it the same way.
Yeah, so it's a really insightful question, and the acronym or DSO gets thrown around a lot. And
Yeah.
hey, I own a DSO. Carl, you want to build a DSO? What the heck is a DSO? And a DSO can mean a lot of different
Two
things.
PO
My
boxes and I have a DS like it's,
yeah,
but that's
yeah.
probably not really relevant. Yeah.
Well, I think so when we talk about group practices, group in its simplest form means more than one location, right?
Yeah.
But like you kind of think about this in phases, or at least I do, having the opportunity to work with so many different people at different stages of their journey. And
Hmm.
the first phase might be something akin to like 2 to 5 locations in a group practice.
Hmm.
This is a business that has multiple locations, it's got multiple providers. It might have multiple owners, or it might have one common owner, but
Hmm.
it's a business that ultimately derives its stability from a decent size and revenue volume and a decent number of providers, so that the business isn't dependent upon either the founder or one particular person
Right.
for its existence. I mean, it's also a business that's still using bank funds to grow. And then you kind
Okay.
of get beyond 5 locations into the 6 to 10 to 20, and you reach a point where you have a decision to make. How big do I want to build this thing, for
Hmm.
one? How far is the bank going to continue to lend? Is it a real business to business banking relationship, or
Right.
am I trying to build 10 locations funded by 3 or 4 different banks, which is a recipe for disaster.
Hmm.
How do I bring associates into the ownership structure of the business to create stability?
Hmm.
And am I going to start to hire a professional management team and really centralize operations, which is really akin to what the promise of a DSO is really all about, that administrative back end, legal
Ah,
structure that
okay.
supports it, and really the next phase of growth where you're going to invest money internally into the business beyond just acquiring additional locations. And then the last phase is obviously uh, usually finding an equity partner like a private equity group to unlock the next phase of growth that
Okay.
might be 20 to 50 plus locations. So
Okay.
there's a little bit of a journey through all that, that is a different point in time and a different mindset, and
Hmm.
candidly a different level of risk involved with all of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So for, I guess for our purposes, then, if it's okay with you, if we could talk about size and then, stop at just before like the sort of the equity investing or the,
Yeah,
where the owners would no longer be, like I said in my intro, sort of, the clinical first, the clinical side.
yeah,
Because it sounds like
yeah.
you can get plenty big before you kind of hit that point.
Well, you can. I think one of the challenges of building a group is understanding how to use bank funding appropriately.
Mm.
Banks love lending money to dentists because dentists never default.
Hmm.
That is when they have 1 to 2 locations. The default rate risk goes up a lot when you get to 3 to 4 to 5 or more locations. And
Really?
banks, yes, very much so.
If you had asked
Um,
me, what do you think, this is smaller, riskier, or bigger, riskier, I would have guessed smaller is probably riskier.
well,
But I'd be wrong, right? So tell me.
Well, from a banking context, let's think about it for just a quick second. The borrower, the dentist, is going to personally guarantee the loan, so that
Mm,
gives the bank some level of security. The borrower, the dentist, who personally guarantees the loan, is usually the primary economic engine in that solo location.
sure.
They are also the CEO, the head of HR, the culture police. They, if they can do the
Yeah,
clinical dentistry with their skill set, and if they have interpersonal skills to convince a patient to accept the treatment that they're proposing, that's a pretty low risk proposition for a
true.
bank.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know, it's different when you have multiple locations and you can't be everywhere at once.
Hmm.
And now that the success of that business is no longer just dependent upon you, which can be a good thing, but it's dependent upon the associates and the other people involved to be able to replicate your successes that you had in the first
It's
location.
dependent on you, the dentist, to no longer be the chief clinician and to be the chief executive.
That's exactly right.
And
And
maybe you're not as good at that. Or yeah,
yeah,
there's more you got to manage. When you manage
yeah,
yourself, you're as good as you. But
exactly.
you. Yeah.
Exactly right. So I think
Interesting.
going back to the original question around, the 2 to 5, 2 to 10 location set, I think too many of them, too many dentists that start down the journey think that the bank that loaned them the money to start is going to be the bank that'll loan them enough money to buy 4 or 5, buy or build 4 or 5 or 10 locations. And usually, we call it the credit box. The way the bank underwrites the loan is really limited in the 1 to 2 location type space. Most retail lenders don't really like going above about $2 million in total loan exposure.
Hmm.
And for that reason, what we typically see is that a dentist who wants to build, 4 or 5 or 8 locations or something, comes to us with 8 locations funded by 3 or 4 different banks, which is a recipe for disaster. We don't need to go into subordinated loan covenants and a lot of other stuff today, but the key thing is that the more banks you involve, the further down the credit risk journey for a bank is, the less willing they're going to be to underwrite the loan. And
Hmm.
eventually, the dentist simply runs at the founder simply runs out of banks that are willing to take the risk on the next location.
Hmm.
That's retail lending. Business to business lending, lower middle market lending, is really about finding the right bank that will agree to not only underwrite the loans that you have presently, but also underwrite your vision for the future,
Mm.
and being able to have what's known as a credit facility. It's a, you and I think of it like a line of credit
Hmm.
almost, that would allow us to go out and buy additional locations every year and have the credit facility roll over as if it were a credit card we're paying off every month. So
Okay.
that's the kind of mindset around using bank funds appropriately. Those businesses that are 2 to 5, 2 to 10 locations are all really based around the ability to. Uh, uh, most of them are growing through acquisition. Some of them do de novo, but most of them are acquisition. So,
Okay.
how do we find the practices we want to buy? How do we rationalize the valuation methodology? How do we
Hmm.
know that we're not overpaying for the practice? And if we do buy that practice, what are 2 to 3 things we're going to do to drive more revenue into it? And what are 2 to 3 things we're going to do to cut a few dollars of cost out of it? And if we
Hmm.
can do all of that, not paying too much, driving a little bit of revenue and curtailing some costs, we know that the business will probably cash flow appropriately to offset the cost of the debt funds, and we can build a more valuable company along the way.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. So you said one of the challenges is the financing. It sounds like how are
yes.
you going to do it, how much, that whole thing. But let me just take a step back. Who should consider building a group practice?
Yeah,
Like, are there characteristics? Is it a profile? Is it like what is it?
this is a question that thankfully I'm getting a lot more of nowadays than what certainly what it was pre-pandemic, and even right on the heels of coming out of the pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like over the last handful of years, there have been far too many people who have simply wanted to build a group practice to sell a group practice. And I don't
Mm.
know that that's good for the profession, and I don't know that that's necessarily the right frame of mind to come into it with based on the risks. So
Yeah.
let's think about, and the proliferation of group practices is still the rage in dentistry specifically, and I think it will be for quite a while. So who should take the risk to do it?
Hmm.
If you are, I don't know, 5 years from retirement, whatever that age is,
Yeah.
I don't know that it's worth the risk to start down that journey.
Hmm.
If you are mid-career, 35, 40 years old, maybe something, and you've got 20 years to go,
Hmm.
I don't think you can ignore it. And the reason for that is, if we go back to a traditional solo practice and just think about the construct of it for a second, um, most of them are insurance-based businesses.
Yeah.
In a traditional solo practice, are insurance reimbursement rates going up or down?
Down. Yeah.
They're going
Even
down,
if they're
right?
flat, your expenses go up. So
Ex-
there's your
ex-
down. Yeah.
exactly. So you've got sort of a cap on revenue as it relates to the insurance mix. You've got, everybody talks about the increase in wages coming out of the pandemic. Now, I'm
Hmm.
sure now that the economy is cooling off, all of our highly paid employees are going to give those salary
Yeah.
increases back, right?
Yeah. They're
That,
lining up for it. Yeah.
yeah, that
Take mine,
probably is going to
please.
happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you've got a arguably an inflated wage scale. The cost of supply chain and everything like that that's been pulled through the economy, we're seeing in services, in goods, lab supplies, everything like that. So the cost of everything is going up. There's a stagnating revenue line in traditional solo practice, which hits the owner right in the back pocket
Hmm.
immediately. So how do we grow our way out of it? Well, Carl, I got a great idea for you. I know you're open 4 days a week right now. Why don't you just open up 5 to 6 days a week
Yeah.
and work harder for longer, right? And
Hmm.
that doesn't sound like the greatest proposition. Now you're involved in marketing. One way we can grow is through a more savvy marketing approach to our
Hmm.
business, and being
Hmm.
able to generate more new patient flows into the business.
Hmm.
The same could be said for, in a general dentistry context at least, being able to possibly take some advanced CE and acquire some equipment or technology
Hmm.
that might allow us to do more complicated treatment that we might
Hmm.
arguably be referring out right now.
Right.
So there is that possibility, but those are still kind of daunting propositions as well. So the construct around a traditional solo practice is is challenging,
Hmm.
from a continuity standpoint if you're mid-career. If you're mid-career and you made a couple $100,000 out of your practice last year, how confident are you that for the next 20 years
Hmm.
you can maintain where the business is and maintain that level of income unabated? And
Right.
I think that right there is the challenge that a lot of mid-career dentists are facing. And so when we see people that are mid-career, they think, well, I got to build a 10 to 20 location group in order to be successful. And I would tell you that you don't.
Hmm.
And if you simply think about being methodical and going about building a multi-location group over the next 5 to 10 years, there is absolutely nothing wrong with building a 4 to 5 location group that cash flows wonderfully. You
Yep.
don't overextend yourself as it relates to debt
Yep.
or stress or associate turnover or any of that.
Yep.
And you can build a really nice lifestyle business over
Yep.
about a decade that cash flows wonderfully. And it will probably be worth a healthy amount if you choose to sell it at the end of
Yeah.
that journey for you. So
Eh,
I think those that are mid-career absolutely need to consider it from the competitive standpoint for sure.
okay. Yeah, and I'll just think of the marketing costs, right? So you marketing costs are X for one location. If you bought a second, it's not 2X.
Right.
It's less than that to market
Right.
set location number two. And it's probably less than 2X for all sorts of other expense categories, right?
Yeah.
And the more efficient you get, the better. So
Yeah, you pick up efficiencies, you pick up cost synergies because you have better negotiating power with
yeah.
suppliers and vendors or insurance companies. You also have the opportunity, if you're in a solo practice and you say, well, I work 4 days a week now, I don't have enough work for another full-time associate
Hmm.
because it's only one practice.
Hmm.
But if I hire another full-time associate and I can drop them in 2 days a week in this practice and a day in a second practice and a day in a third practice,
Hmm.
now I'm starting to think not just in terms of half of a warm body, but how I allocate those resources
Yeah.
for the overall revenue lift to take advantage of the
Right.
fixed costs of the
Right.
business.
So mid-career, one kind of clear, I'd say, descriptor. Are the other kind of big, like I'm thinking of, for example, does somebody need to just sort of have the entrepreneurial fire or just a certain amount of, business acumen? Um, or they're an awesome dentist, but they're looking at this going, what are some other characteristics of those who should consider it? Or maybe they just be good at it if they did.
Yeah, it's a really good question because the founder's role is more than likely going to change over that
Hmm.
evolution that I just alluded to.
Hmm.
And you find that the first thing is when somebody starts adding additional locations and that role starts to change either reactively or proactively,
Yeah.
they end up having to allocate a little bit more time to leadership and administrative duties,
Hmm.
which pulls them away from the chair if they've been practicing clinically full time. So
Hmm.
when they start hiring an associate to pick up a day a week for them, one of the things they're not ready for is that they're going to take an income hit to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So there's only so much cash sloshing around in these businesses.
Hmm.
And you've got to really be mindful and you've got to be intentional about the way you transition your clinical load because the the patients, the need for clinical services doesn't disappear when you start cutting days a week. And
Hmm.
so when we do that, we're paying somebody to do work that we're no longer doing. So
Hmm.
that's the first thing. We try to help coach our clients and predict a potential income hit as they go through this clinician to CEO
Yeah.
transition, like we talk about. The second
Hmm.
thing is, okay, I'm working administratively. What does that mean? Like,
Hmm.
what do I do? Right. And that is building culture in multiple locations when you can't be everywhere at once. It's
Hmm.
really easy to establish culture when you're in those four walls 4 days a week because it's all about you. It's
Yeah.
different when you have multiple locations. So, how do we extrapolate that? Systems and processes that made your core business really
Yeah.
successful, how do we replicate that in multiple locations? As the founder and the person guaranteeing the loans, you want to make certain that in subsequent locations, the dentistry is being done to your liking. And
Hmm.
this is something that not too many people think about from a clinical compliance or a clinical philosophy
Yeah.
standpoint, but
Yeah.
it is critically important because over treatment and under treatment are two sides of the same coin, as we like to
Hmm.
say. And while you may have a really good handle on that because it's your business, you should not assume that every other provider in the business does.
Yeah.
So this is, when we start thinking about like those duties, those responsibilities, and the areas that create jeopardy in the business, it can be all of that. The last thing I'll say is, and this is sort of dependent upon how big of a business you want to build, but the likelihood is if you build a 4 to 5 location or more type of a business, you should be thinking about and probably planning on some of your associates becoming partners in the business
Hmm.
somehow, either through a buy-in or an earn-in or a hybrid model. But
Hmm.
you would like to create associate stability, and the best stability comes from partnership opportunities for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Once you decide they're good and you want to keep them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's sort of the nature of the market.
Yep.
Um, yeah. Interesting. So this isn't for everybody, you know. So they want to stay small or smaller. What are the consequences of that? We kind of talked about it a bit, reimbursement flat, expenses going up, so that's a big one. But like,
Yeah.
what, you've seen both sides. What are some consequences?
Yeah. There are a lot of them. And I think the biggest one is that the scenario we see most often is probably that somebody has a successful solo practice. They are mid-career and they get bored because
Mm,
dentistry can become a little bit like Groundhog Day if you're not careful. And I
yeah,
get it. But just because you're bored doesn't mean that you should start guaranteeing loans and going out and buying practices when you're not eyes wide open about the journey ahead.
yeah.
And so when that happens, they tend to overpay for a practice because they're working through a network of brokers, and there's nothing wrong with brokers, but brokers represent the seller
Hmm.
and brokers want to get paid. We all do. And the best way for a broker to get paid when representing a seller's practice is to broadcast that practice to every potential buyer that's out there in the marketplace and
Hmm.
hopefully have the practice sell for a premium.
Hmm.
And if so, the seller will obviously get paid and the broker will get paid.
Hmm.
Well, that's not the best thing for somebody wanting to buy a business. They would rather not be in a bidding war. Rather not overpay for the practice.
Yeah.
And for that reason, they should start networking ahead of time to find some colleagues that might be looking to exit and might not want to work through a brokered process. So that would be the
Hmm.
first thing. The second thing is they don't really understand that once again, a broker represents a practice typically from an owner cash flow type of a model, which is fine when you're taking that practice for sale to a bank to see if you personally qualify for a loan.
Hmm.
However, if I'm going to buy that practice, I'm probably going to employ an associate to work in that practice, and I have to pay the associate to do that work. And after
Hmm.
I pay the associate, then I've got to pay the loan on the bank and I've got to pay some taxes on it. And
Hmm.
whatever's left over is what I get to keep in my personal bank account.
Hmm.
And what I just rattled through there from paying the associate to paying taxes and paying the bank, there ain't a whole lot of there left in most practices.
Yeah.
And so this is one where people start acquiring practices, and if they overpay for a business that doesn't cash flow wonderfully, and if they can't generate revenue growth out of it, if they can't generate cost reduction out of it, now they're barely breaking even, if any at all. And
Hmm.
the great solo practice that they started with is now funding the practice that's cash flow negative. And
Mm.
this is the oh no moment that
Hmm.
most people confront early on in their journey.
Right.
So I would tell you that, if you can just simply not make those mistakes and understand the type of margin for error you have on the home front,
Hmm.
you stand a better chance of surviving the initial phase, but it is absolutely something you should plan on in terms of reallocating cash to invest back into the business for
Yeah.
growth purposes if you're going to go through it.
When you said they're bored, and I had this flash when I was growing up, a really good friend of my father's, he was root canal oral surgeon something, and he was terribly bored. But then he went and taught, He drove 3 hours each way once a week to go teach a class at Boston University School of Dentistry, and that's what lit his fire, and that was great. So, and the reason I bring that up is there's a difference between running away from something you don't like compared to running towards something you do. And I think I'll buy a practice because I'm bored. You just checked one box, but not necessarily the other. And so be clear on what you would want to do rather than just what you'd want to get away from. They're different.
That's
Especially
exactly
something like this.
right.
My God, when I have a midlife crisis and buy a car, fine. A practice, holy cow, not the same thing.
Yeah, you're 100% correct, because what makes that initial practice so successful is usually the founder owner of it. It's
Yeah.
his or her clinical skill set. It's his or her ability to build a team. It's his or her case presentation. It's all about him or her.
Hmm.
It's different when you have additional locations and you can't be everywhere at once.
Yeah.
So what makes you great in a multi-location ownership structure is more leadership than clinical abilities,
Hmm.
and that is just something that, again, people don't necessarily plan for when
Yeah.
they go into it.
Yeah, if you think about a dental practice or any practice as sort of the clinical versus the business, we'll say there's a balance. When it's sole proprietor, it's very
Yeah,
clinical. And as long as you're smart enough, the business will do well. That balance changes and the weights of each one change. The larger you get, it's more business that happens to be a clinical business, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Couple of wrap up questions. We could keep going. I say this to just about every guest. These topics are so interesting, and there's 5 or 6 more questions I could ask. But in the interest of more bite sized advice, a couple of wrap up questions I ask every guest. First one, just to cover bases, anything you think I should have asked you, but just didn't ask you that listeners need to hear?
Yeah, well, that would be episodes 2, 3, and
Right.
4, right?
We'll have a series.
um,
Yeah.
no, I mean there's a lot more to it than what we just rattled off, but hopefully this gave your audience some things to think about maybe.
Sure.
Um, I think there's always the valuation question, especially with rising rates, and what is
Mm,
the cost of debt funds due to the market from a sell side advisory. I mentioned earlier before. We do represent group practices and high value sellers and in the marketplace. So that is a component of our business. I think where we are right now in the world of M&A is that the rising cost of funds is creating a lot of pressure at the top end of the food chain, because so many of the enterprise level DSOs that are private equity backed they take on a lot of debt to accelerate their growth strategy, and that's usually
mhm.
in a variable rate component. So when you see credit boxes tightening and rates rising, that has an adverse impact on the top end of the market. And I think the trickle down effect is that there's less M&A volume going on, and there's less M&A activity overall going on right
And
now.
when you say
But
top end, do you mean like the top tier lenders or the top tier assets, like business practices for sale?
well, I would say that when I say the top end of the food chain, I mean like the enterprise level DSOs that kind of set
Got
the
it.
tempo for how exit, people looking to sell practices and groups are playing out and everything.
Okay.
That being said, I also think that there are going to be a lot of people looking to exit practices in the coming year to two
Mm,
years, that the buy side might not be as white hot as it used to be. Now,
okay.
that's a good thing for people who are potentially looking at building group practices in a methodical kind of way,
Okay.
because if they have low debt on their practice or two practices right now, they for all intents and purposes have some level of dry powder, and they can afford to be patient. And I think
Hmm.
now is a good time to be networking with people who might be contemplating retirement in the not too distant future. And I think usually in economic contractions, there are a lot of great businesses that are built during those, and there are also a lot of businesses that show uh, rapid but methodical expansion during cyclical downturns.
Yeah.
And I think this will be every bit that for our world, and I think it bodes really well for the what we call doctor founded, debt funded space.
Okay. Cool. And then the other question I ask every guest to wrap up is, so the scenario is, we've caught a listener's attention. and they are, maybe what you said of mid-career, you should look at this, and they say, you know what, I should look at this. And they get enthusiastic about the idea, or they are, but they're stuck at the starting line because they just don't know how to get started. Are there one or two simple things they could do to get off the starting line and start to go down the path of figuring this out for them?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I think we touched around this at the start, but let me be really clear to your audience. We work with group practices and we help them grow their business, scale their business, improve their business, and ultimately sell their business. That being said, I am not in the business of talking people into this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's the right journey for everyone, and there's enough risk and danger associated with this that it should not be taken lightly. That being said, I'll give you two things for your audience to consider. One
Okay.
is, I ask this question of every client, and I think when I get to speak on a stage, this slide is in almost every deck that we present. And that is, Carl, if we're having this conversation 3 to 5 years down the road, what does success look like for you
Mm-hmm.
personally and professionally? It is hard to separate personal and professional as it
Yeah.
relates to success, and building a multi-location group will place demands on you and your family if you choose to go down that road. So what does success look like for you personally and professionally 3 to 5 years down the road? That's the question your audience should be asking themselves if they're contemplating this. The second thing I'll say is, for those who want to maybe dive a little bit deeper or just access some educational content, we got this sort of train of thought question so much that the light bulb finally went off to me that we ought to build some educational curriculum around it. We built a 6-week course called the Catalyst Project, and it is all about the
Okay.
fundamentals of, I call it, getting the boat off the dock. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you think you want to build a group practice, like, where do you start? And that 6-week course, it's a web-based course. I teach all of them. It's live. We record them and everything. You
Mm-hmm.
can find more information off of our website about the Catalyst Project, and I can send you a link to it. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a great 6-week course that either gets you thinking in the right way and gets you tactically to do the right things to set yourself up for taking the next step, or it makes you really happy with the success of the business that you built and you're content to stay where you are.
Perfect.
And
So it
either
helps
one
you
of
answer the
those are,
question one way or the
yeah,
other.
either
Got it.
one of those are great outcomes, I think.
Perfect.
So
I
hopefully some of your audience will dive into that.
Yeah, I'll take that link and we'll put it in the show notes for the episode, please.
Wonderful. Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
And on that note, perfect. Thank you, Perrin, for coming on, for shedding some light on this. We've had a decent number of topics about scaling and growing from different perspectives. And I would say if I had to sum them up, they're, should you do this? It's not an automatic yes. And if so, how? Whether it's from the funding or the, your perspective, or from the hiring or whatever perspective. So there's a nice, but you can tell it's a big topic because it's not hard to find guests to come on and talk about it. So thank you for coming on and doing so.
My pleasure, Carl. I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to be with you, and look forward to doing it again at some point in the future too. You're a good
Yes.
interviewer. So
Yes. Emails will be going out about guests coming back. So Perrin DesPortes, Polaris Healthcare Partners. Um, we're going to get all your contact information that you supplied into the show notes for the episode, including the link to the 6-week course, so that anyone who wants to find out more or contact you, that's one way to do it. Couple of points before we wrap up. First, if you're someone like Perrin or us and you serve private practice owners and you've got some experience and expertise you want to share, or if you're a private practice owner yourself and you've figured out some stuff on the business side of private practice that you think others would benefit from, either way, we want you to come on Practice Care and tell the world about it. In the show notes for Perrin's episode and every episode, there's a link, a couple of questions. Tell us what's on your mind so we can get you scheduled as soon as possible. And finally, subscribe to Practice Care. We do a new episode every week. We're on Apple, we're on Google, we're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, we're on every major player and platform. We're easy to find, but the easiest way to stay up to date on new episodes is if you subscribe so that when they are launched, you'll get them right away. Thanks very much, and until next time.